What happens when an ordinary waitress steps up to a desperate millionaire father and whispers, "I can awaken your son," after the entire hospital has given up hope? Who is she? Why does she believe in the impossible? And can a real miracle truly unfold? All right, my dear viewers, brace yourselves for a story that will leave you breathless. Remember to hit like and subscribe if this reaches your heart. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd love to know which corner of the world you're joining me from as we dive into this tale. Lucas Brennan was once the epitome of success, a celebrated CEO of a multi-billion-dollar AI corporation whose every decision could sway the market. But no algorithm could help him process his grief. No line of code could save his son from the dark coma that had enveloped the boy's young mind. 6 months ago, everything Lucas understood about stability was torn apart on a rainy afternoon. An accident, frantic messages, the wail of sirens, waterlogged shoes splashing down the hospital corridor in a panic. He arrived only to see his wife's body growing cold on the operating table, while his son, little Eli, lay motionless, his eyes shut tight, offering no promise of ever opening again. Since then, everything had slipped through Lucas's fingers like sand. Meetings vanished, every second of his schedule replaced by hours spent with his head bowed beside that ICU bed. The busyness that once sustained him had given way to weary waiting and fading hope. ICU room 412 had no clock, no sunlight, only the cold hum of machines and shallow mechanical breaths. Lucas no longer went home. His office was now the chair by his son's bed, a hospital blanket draped over his legs, his laptop gathering dust in his backpack. He ate perfunctorily, showered in passing, a specter in his own life. A specter who knew despair, knew silence, knew how to breathe in utter hopelessness. The doctors told him bluntly, in tones they thought gentle but felt like icy blades. No neurological response. The odds of recovery are near zero. Those words replayed in Lucas's mind every night like a cruel mantra. Yet, strangely, they kept him there. No one had said absolutely none. And as long as even 1%, 1,000th remained, he would not leave that bedside. Each day he watched his child, a boy who once raced through their home calling toast little sons, who insisted on 3 readings of the dinosaur book before sleep, now reduced to a small body lying still amid a tangle of tubes. The face, framed by long lashes like a dream paused, showed no movement, no sign of life. And that, wondering whether his son still lingered somewhere inside that body or had slipped away forever, was a pain Lucas could not bear. He once controlled every variable in life, markets, teams, technology, even the future of artificial intelligence. Now he was powerless before the most basic variable of all, his child's life. Lucas had believed strength was never breaking, but every day he sat there, silently fracturing within, unseen by anyone. He still wore his suit, wrinkled from sleepless nights, his tie still knotted, though no one cared anymore, as if a fragment of his old self clung on in desperate hope. No one visited now. Busy colleagues, relatives at a loss for words. Everyone told him to rest, to accept the inevitable. But how could he? He had lost his partner, his companion, the light of his life. If he let go of Eli, what would remain? Each night Lucas tortured himself with the unspoken question. If one day he had to order the breathing machine turned off, could he go on living? And each time that thought surfaced, he squeezed his son's hand so tightly. He needed to feel warmth, any warmth, even an illusion. He needed to believe Eli was still fighting. Lucas did not believe in miracles. He was a man of data, of logic. But a father's heart requires no reason, only a breath, a tiny movement, a faint sound. Anything to prove his child remained there. Yet day after day, all Lucas received was the steady rhythm of machines. And silence. Silence so thick, it felt as though it buried him alive, a little more each day. That night, Lucas left the hospital in silence, not because his shift was over, nor because there was any new news, simply because he could not endure another night in that room, listening to the machines humming a soundtrack of helplessness. ICU room 412 had become a box of endless waiting for a sign, a change, or at least the smallest response. But all he received was silence, prolonged, icy, and merciless. He wandered aimlessly until the harsh white light of a small diner in downtown Nashville came into view. A place with nothing remarkable. At least it lacked the smell of antiseptic, blank white walls, and pitying nods from doctors. He entered, sat at a window table, ordered a black coffee, and stared down at the scratched wooden tabletop. No phone, no laptop, no companion, only the rising steam of his coffee and the swirl of his thoughts in an inescapable loop. After a while, when his coffee had grown cold and his hand remained motionless on the table, the waitress approached, not with a forced smile nor idle chit-chat, but a gentle presence and unwavering eyes fixed on him. She stood there in her simple uniform, and when she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and unshaken. "I can awaken your son." Lucas froze. He looked up as if he'd misheard. His eyes were rimmed red from sleepless nights, and for a moment he thought he must be imagining things. But her gaze did not flicker. It did not waver or hesitate. It was calm, almost defiantly so. Her name was Grace Larkin. She was nearly half his age, an ordinary diner waitress working the late shift. Yet standing before him, she was nothing like anyone he'd met before. No pity, no scrutiny. She did not regard him as the man on the brink of losing everything. Grace had studied emotional rehabilitation, a field that many regarded as vague, with little place in modern medicine. She had abandoned her program when her mother died after a long coma. From that time, she understood that emotions, if awakened properly, could be more powerful than any drug. Her voice did not tremble. There was no empty promise, no arrogant claim. Nothing in her words suggested blind hope. Yet there was one thing clear, almost startling: belief. A quiet, seemingly irrational faith that made Lucas, who had lost faith in everything, look up at her. He stared, searching for something familiar in her face, but all he saw was a young woman with neatly tied hair, deep eyes, and a steady posture. "Do you know who I am?" Lucas asked, hoarse. Grace nodded lightly, but her answer was not what he expected. "That doesn't matter," she said. "I only see that you need something that I can help with." Lucas said nothing more. No questions, no objections, no nod of acceptance. Yet the look in his eyes, the look that had stayed dark for months, flickered with a faint, fragile light. Not quite hope, but the first crack in his despair. Grace departed immediately, without another word. She left the bill, but Lucas did not look at it. He sat a while longer, his hand brushing the rim of the cold coffee cup. Her words echoed in his mind, etched into his thought as if carved there. "I can awaken your son." It was the first sentence in months that made his heart ache, not with pain, but with hope. a slender spark, defying all reason, seeking to rekindle in a man all too accustomed to darkness. And though he did not yet know what to do next, he knew he would never forget those eyes or that voice on the night everything seemed truly over. Lucas didn't agree at once. His first reflex was to refuse, a slight shake of the head, as if the offer weren't worth his attention. Not because he thought it insane, but because he'd grown accustomed to rejecting all hollow hopes, all meaningless advice, all therapies that led nowhere. He had learned to shut the door on everything. And yet, only a few steps after the young woman turned away, he found himself calling her back. Not because he believed her, but because he had nothing left to believe in. The next day, Grace returned to the hospital. No name badge, no white coat, none of the trappings of the system. In her worn backpack, not modern medical gadgets, but the unlikeliest tools for an ICU room. A tiny speaker, a battered notebook, a half-used bottle of peppermint oil, and a wooden box brimming with family voice recordings. Recordings Lucas himself had made when his wife was still alive. They had once hoped those voices would help Eli learn to speak, to recognize sounds. Now they returned, offering a different kind of hope, more fragile, more remote. Grace didn't ask permission from the department. She held no meetings with doctors. She presented no academic credentials. She simply sat by the boy's bed, no fanfare, no introduction. She placed the speaker by Eli's pillow and played the first recording, Lucas's wife telling him a bedtime story, her warm voice rising from a vanished world. Lucas, standing in a corner, said nothing. He watched the young woman's hand touch the speaker as if keeping time to a song no one else could hear. Grace's method was no magic. She called it tactile memory therapy, an unorthodox approach found in no medical textbook. She combined familiar sounds, the scent of peppermint oil, gentle touches on Eli's hand and forehead, and soft whispers repeated again and again. No machines, just one human being reaching another, a presence that was real, warm, steadfast. Nurses peeked through the doorway. Some furrowed their brows, some whispered. To them, it was a ridiculous spectacle, a tender but meaningless charade. But Lucas paid no mind. He had endured days of strict protocol and pristine professionalism while his son lay unresponsive. Now, he would try anything, no matter how improbable. Grace worked without pause. No grand gestures, no demand for recognition. Each day, she brought a new recording. Eli's laughter as a toddler, Lucas whistling in the backyard, his wife calling the two of them to dinner. She let the sounds fill the room, then gently placed her hand on Eli's, moment by moment. No coercion, no urging. She invited the memories to wash over him like soft rain. The peppermint scent drifted from the oil, never overwhelming, only suggestive. Grace explained that in the studies she'd read, scent is the most direct pathway to primal emotion, and that Eli needed a reason to find his way back. Lucas watched from behind the glass. No interference, no intrusion. But each day, he arrived a little earlier, stayed a little longer. He didn't know if anything real was happening or if he was clinging to illusion. But when he saw her place her hand on his son's chest, her eyes closed, lips moving in time with the ventilator's breath, he knew he was no longer alone in his waiting. No one believed this could make a difference. But to Lucas, Grace brought more than a technique. She brought life, not the kind measured by medical charts, but the life of a human soul, of belief, of something stronger than science. Hope. And in that moment, that hope, small as a flickering ember, began to glow again within him. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or grab a drink, then stay tuned for the next surprising chapter. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to connect with people from around the world. Comment 1 if this story resonated with you, so we can keep bringing you more inspiring tales. Grace began her work at exactly 9 a.m., as if performing an unspoken ritual that no one had requested, yet she carried out with unwavering dedication. Every day she spent 4 hours at Eli's bedside. No haste, no grand gestures. She carried no high-tech equipment, no stethoscope around her neck, no keyboard to track vital signs, only the simplest items that nonetheless filled a world of memories. A mini speaker sat beside his pillow, its volume low, just enough to fill the room like a gentle wave. She played recordings from the past. Eli's mother singing him lullabies before sleep. Eli's own laughter echoing as he played with his father in the backyard. Snippets of Lucas reading fairy tales at night, his voice steady and soft as a breeze. Grace did more than press play and sit quietly. She created a rhythm, a sequence of repeated actions, as though reconstructing a familiar evening in Eli's world. She tapped his hand in time with the jazz rhythms his parents once enjoyed, not unconsciously, but with deliberate intent. She believed in emotional memory, that the body could recall truths the mind could not yet name. After each recording, she smoothed the blanket over Eli, gently stroked his hair as though guiding him back to sleep, and whispered her closing line every session. "Daddy's here. Mommy's here. You are not alone." She spoke as if Eli were listening, because that phrase alone bridged a living world, and one frozen in time. Every gesture of Grace's was executed with extraordinary patience. There was no response from Eli, no sign, no reaction. But Grace did not falter. Her persistence seemed not to rely on results, but on the belief that a sincere effort always reaches the deepest places. Nurses watched from the doorway at first with curiosity, then with doubt. Some frowned, some whispered, and one young doctor shook his head and muttered, "This is ICU, not a theater. We don't need dreamers here." They never confronted Grace directly, but she heard the whispers. She felt the alienation in each passing step down the hall. Yet she did not respond. She simply continued, every day, at the same time in the same sequence, rewriting a story for a boy who once knew love, once knew laughter, once knew how to listen. Lucas did not intervene. He stood behind the glass like a silent shadow. He never asked what she was doing, never demanded an explanation. But that day, when he overheard the young doctor call Grace's work an illusion, something in him shifted. He stepped out of the shadows. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and inescapable. "Then tell me the name of anyone here who's made my son shed a single tear." No one answered. The room fell into a silence as though all sound had been sucked away. No rebuttal, no defense, only bowed heads and averted eyes. And from that moment on, Grace was no longer alone. Lucas began arriving earlier. He brought her a cup of coffee, setting it quietly on the table beside the bed. No words, but his gaze less vacant, his steps less dragging. Occasionally, he would cue up a new recording, ask when to play it, what volume to set. His presence did not disrupt her work. Rather, it signaled that someone else believed in her too, that her faith was no longer solitary. And in that silence, every small moment began to carry weight, not because Eli changed, but because they did. And hope, however fragile, began to take root. Day 15 began just like the days before. The room was silent. The monitors hummed steadily. a monotonous soundtrack with no end in sight. Lucas sat by the bed, holding an old, worn-cover book, the dinosaur adventure story that Eli had demanded be read over and over. He began to read in his measured tone, expecting nothing extraordinary. He no longer read out of hope. He read to preserve a fading memory of an old routine between father and son. Grace sat in the corner, unobtrusive. She still watched every movement, every breath. Nothing changed, until, midway through the story, Lucas paused. His eyes widened. A blink? No, but something, a very slight movement of Eli's eyelid. Lucas's heart clenched. He leaned forward, silence pressing so hard it hurt. Grace immediately moved closer. She did not call a doctor. She did not hit an alarm. She leaned in, placing her ear near the boy, and whispered in a warm, gentle voice, soft as a breath, "If you can hear your mother, take a deep breath for her." All was still. Lucas dared not move, as if the slightest gesture would erase what had just happened. Then, the respiratory monitor's graph ticked up ever so slightly, a fragile signal that could have been missed if no one were watching. And then, the single tear appeared. A solitary tear slid down from the corner of Eli's left eye, tracing his cheek as though carrying part of a dream striving to return. There was no sound, no other movement, only that one tear, and it was enough to stop all breathing in the room. Lucas could no longer contain himself. He collapsed to his knees by the bed, his trembling hands clenching his son's small one. Months of unspoken prayers, carefully prepared words, suppressed emotions, all burst forth in that silence. His eyes were red and glistening, but still wide open, afraid that if he blinked, it would vanish. Grace remained by the far side of the bed. She said nothing. She stared at Eli for a long moment, as if etching that instant into her very soul. Her eyes welled with tears, but her face held a gentle smile, quiet and steady, not an explosion of emotion like Lucas's, but enough to show that she, too, trembled within. The next 3 days stretched longer than any before. No one spoke of what had happened. No one dared. They feared hope, fearing that naming it would make it disappear. But Lucas arrived earlier, stayed later. He did not leave the room, nor read the story again. He simply sat, holding his son's hand, waiting in silence. By day 18 on a quiet afternoon, everything changed forever. Lucas was refilling the plastic flower vase in the corner, a small task he did daily to feel in control of something, when he turned and saw the impossible. Eli's eyes were open. Not fully, not quickly, but clearly. They blinked a few times as though reacquainting themselves with light, with the world he had long left behind. Lucas froze. His heart felt as if it stopped. He stepped slowly to the bed, leaned in, and whispered, "Eli." The boy turned his head very slightly toward that familiar voice. Then a sound, soft, hoarse, but unmistakable. "Dad." Lucas could no longer stand. His knees buckled to the floor as he cupped his face, sobs bursting forth like a dam breaking. No barrier remained, no restraint. Pain, joy, loss, and hope all poured out at once. He grasped his son's hand, pressed it to his cheek, as if to confirm he was not dreaming. Grace. She remained motionless. She did not rush forward, did not cry out, did not speak. Yet tears glistened in her eyes, her hands clasped before her as if holding fast to the miracle unfolding in her heart. A smile spread across her lips, thin as an unspoken "thank you," gentle as a prayer answered. And in that moment there was no science, no proof, no explanation, only three people, one tear, one softly spoken word, and a miracle that had just occurred. A year had passed since everything began to change. Lucas had left the old apartment, where every corner once echoed with his wife's laughter, his son's laughter, and the silence of loss, and moved into a small house on the outskirts of Asheville. Not for its beauty, not for its comforts, but because it lay far enough from the past to begin something new. Not to forget, but to live again. In the backyard, where Lucas replanted each flower bush from his son's memory, a small wedding was underway. No fanfare, no loud music, no billowing gown or long tables draped in white silk. Yet everything glowed with a gentle, genuine light, reflecting the way they had walked through life together. Golden fairy lights hung from the great oak, twinkling like blessings from days gone by. Beneath that canopy, Eli, now 6 years old, tossed the bridal bouquet skyward with uncontainable glee. His clear laughter rang out, a triumphant exclamation mark on all they had endured. The boy who once lay motionless in a hospital bed now hopped through the grass, cheeks rosy, clutching his old dinosaur pillow, still his favorite toy from long ago. Lucas stood beside Grace, his hand gently squeezing hers, a small gesture, rich with emotion. He gazed at her as if he could not quite believe that the woman who had appeared in that late-night diner, with calm eyes and a strange promise, now stood before him in a simple dress, his wife, the one his heart had chosen anew. There was no lengthy speech, no pastor, no religious ritual. But when they looked at each other, their eyes spoke volumes that words could never capture. Lucas leaned toward Grace, his voice low and sincere, no script, no cliches. "You didn't just bring my son back. You brought me back from the brink." Grace did not answer right away. She smiled, her eyes glistening with a light only those who have known deep pain can carry. She needed no words, because at that moment, words were superfluous. Then Eli ran to them, unscripted, without waiting to be called. He threw his arms around them, as though binding them together, never to part again. "We're a family now, right?" Eli looked up, eyes wide and bright. Grace laughed softly, not loudly, but with all the weight of that moment. She bent to press her hand to his soft hair, whispering the affirmation he had waited so long for. "We always have been." Lucas said nothing. He simply looked at his son, then his wife, and nodded. Because he knew, family does not begin with a wedding. It begins when people choose not to leave one another in the darkest of days. None of the three of them was perfect. They were not born for each other, but they chose each other, at the right time, through the right kind of pain, and that is what made them a family. No fireworks, no lavish feast, but in that little garden, there was something grander than any ceremony, the peace that three hearts had finally found. Eli did not know of his father's nightmares, nor the sleepless nights his mother had spent whispering fairy tales by his bedside. He did not remember the moment Lucas first wept upon hearing him say "Daddy," but in that small embrace lay an invisible strength, the power to heal unseen fractures. And in that ceremony, no one shed a tear. There was no need, for there was nothing left to mourn. Only simple joy, and a silent promise in each heart that no matter how far the past had driven them, they had found their way home. Not back to a house, back to one another. I once believed that to protect my son, I had to be strong, powerful, and in complete control. Yet in the end, what saved both of us came from the gentle faith of a stranger. No spotlight, no grand promises, only unwavering, quiet sincerity. Perhaps we don't need miraculous powers to change a life. Sometimes all it takes is someone who believes the impossible can happen. And if you're listening to this story, perhaps you are that silent miracle for someone out there. Thank you for watching to the end. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share this video with loved ones who might need a glimmer of hope. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you, because you just might be the reason someone continues to believe.